December 16th, 1944, Ardennes, Belgium. On that freezing morning, the German High Command still believed that the surprise factor would suffice. General Alfred Jodl had assured us that the lightning offensive would dismantle the Allies in a few days. The reports were optimistic. The weather prevented aviation, American troops were dispersed and exhausted. For Berlin, the terrain, winter and speed would be enough. That trust was about to collide with a reality they didn't know and didn't understand. For the first time in the war, artillery shells would explode in the air, not on the ground. A few meters above the trees, invisible sensors would detect the exact moment to kill. It was the silent birth of a new kind of war, not against positions but against outdated military logic. This documentary will reveal the tactical, psychological and strategic impact of the most underrated of American weapons, the proximity fuse, a device the size of a coffee can that turned the sky into a battlefield and the forests into death traps. What the German generals hoped would be a triumph of the past became the brutal announcement of the future, and on that frozen morning, death stopped coming from the front. She began to fall from above. But before we dive into the technical details, there's one statistic that defines the spirit of this story and anticipates its outcome. In just one barrage of fire over the Sauer River, 702 German soldiers were killed in minutes by a single American battery equipped with proximity fuses. There was no hand-to-hand combat, no line of sight. The shells exploded in the air, alone, with almost surgical precision. It felt like magic. For the survivors, the phrase most repeated in the interrogations was simple and desperate. The artillery had eyes. Over the next few parts, you'll learn how this type of weapon rewrote the mathematics of war and why Germany, for all its scientific cachet, refused to believe that such a thing was possible until it was too late. If you value this kind of accurate reconstruction of history, with data, context, and respect for detail, consider leaving your support behind the channel. A like and its inscription help us to keep this memory alive, without exaggeration, without empty heroism, only the truth of the facts, as it happened. December 1944. The Ardennes were silent, covered in thick snow that drowned out the sound of footsteps and froze the engines through the night. In that white, motionless landscape, Hitler saw an opportunity. German intelligence assessed that the Allies were overconfident, too scattered, and that winter would put American air power on pause. This was the axis of the offensive, a last-minute bet based on an illusion. German generals predicted that without dominance of the sky, the United States would once again be an ordinary ground force, slow, poorly coordinated, and easy to dismantle. The mission was clear: break through the American lines, capture Antwerp, isolate the British, and force an armistice on the Western Front. Hitler christened the operation Wacht am Rhein, Guard on the Rhine, but for the soldiers on the ground it would be the last major Reich attack. About 200,000 German troops were mobilized with 1,000 tanks and 1,900 artillery pieces, many coming directly from the Eastern Front hardened by years of fighting. The goal was to break American morale in a single blow. It was a vision of war that belonged to the past, and that completely ignored the new reality that the United States had already built. The fundamental error of the offensive was logistical and epistemological. The Americans were believed to fight like the Europeans, with fragile supply lines and intermittent production. The truth was different. In 1944, while Germany was barely able to fill its tanks with synthetic fuel, the United States was delivering 11 million tons of supplies a month to Western Europe alone. For each German division in the Ardennes, there was an American supply line supported by 1,500 ships, 1,800 trains, 16,000 trucks, and 165,000 men in logistical roles alone. Industrial warfare was silent, but relentless. No German general seemed to grasp the depth of this. The Luftwaffe could no longer supply its own hangars, while American factories operated 24 hours a day. The morale of the German troops was still high, especially among the veterans transferred from the East. They saw American soldiers as unprepared, technically inferior, and emotionally fragile. But these same soldiers now had at their disposal a logistics chain so efficient that it delivered hot meals, calibrated ammunition, and spare parts directly to the front line, often in conditions that made German mobility impossible. The Nazi High Command was betting that bad weather would stop the Allied bombers. They bet that American communications would be slow. They bet that the morale of Western soldiers would collapse under pressure. They completely ignored a decisive factor. Americans no longer depended exclusively on airplanes. They had built a solution that worked under snow, fog, and darkness. A solution that required only artillery and science. This German assumption, that winter leveled the battlefield, would be the most fatal of the entire campaign. At the very moment when its troops were advancing in closed columns through the forests of the Ardennes, the United States began firing a new generation of munitions that exploded in the air without needing an observer. The calculation was wrong from the start. In industrial terms, the numbers were even more unbalanced. By December 1944, the United States was producing more than 40,000 proximity fuses per day. Germany, bogged down by bombing raids and material constraints, could not produce even 500 units a month of any similar technology, and no functional equivalent. It was an 80-fold difference in just one type of ammunition. If this statistic surprises you, comment below. Absolute power, shocking data, or simply logistics wins. This helps us understand the impact that this type of data still causes. Because for the Axis generals, this impact came too late. Germany was prepared to fight soldiers, not against equations, and not against sensors the size of an apple which flew inside the projectiles and decided on their own when to explode. In the white silence of the Ardennes, Germany was moving forward with faith in the victorious tactics of 1940. What they did not know is that, on the American side, a solitary decision about to be made that very dawn would change the fate of the entire battle. The order would come from a single man, no superior permission, no time for consultation, and it would field for the first time in ground combat the most accurate weapon ever used up to that point in the war. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson was not a charismatic hero, nor a central figure in history textbooks. He was a pragmatic technical officer in charge of the 406th Artillery Group in a sector that, until that week, was considered calm. But on the morning of December 16th, 1944, that changed. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, a light reconnaissance unit positioned north of Monschau, was suddenly overwhelmed by a superior German force. Tanks advanced, the line retreated, and calls for support multiplied on the radio. The German offensive had begun. Axelson knew that traditional artillery would not be enough. Their guns could deliver standard mortars and explosives, but the results would be inaccurate, especially against troops dispersed and protected by forest cover. The barrage, as intense as it was, offered little effect if the shrapnel remained contained to the ground. It was at this point that Axelson looked at a locked box at the bottom of his storage room. It contained something that no commander at the front was authorized to use on the ground: projectiles equipped with VT fuses, the dreaded proximity fuses, an innovation still kept secret by the military authorities. Officially, these devices were restricted to anti-aircraft use, for fear that if one of them fell into German hands, the secret could be reversed and used against the Allies. General Eisenhower himself had ratified this order, but Axelson didn't have time to follow protocols. He did not request permission. He ordered right there the immediate exchange of ammunition. His gunners hesitated. The manuals said that land use was prohibited, but the colonel interrupted them. He knew that if he didn't break the rules, he would lose the industry. It wasn't a brave decision. It was a mathematical decision. The Germans were winning. Logic said that he needed to invert the equation. Within minutes, the American howitzers began firing a new sequence. The shells went up as usual, but this time they didn't wait to touch the ground. Equipped with small internal radars, the fuses detected the exact moment to detonate, between 30 and 50 feet above the enemy columns. The explosion happened in the air, creating a cloud of fragments that spread out in a lethal cone, hitting areas that no conventional artillery could reach. It was as if the bullets had intelligence of their own. On the German side, the perception was immediate. Experienced men, many of them from the Eastern Front, accustomed to recognizing patterns of fire, did not know how to react. The trenches are no longer safe. The branches of the trees, once covered, now multiplied the splinters. Traditional tactical formations, with advance in concentrated groups, have become mobile traps. Axelson watched the impacts by radio from the forward observers. The answer was clear. The Germans were retreating. The dam didn't just stop them, disorganized them. Before long, the 38th Squadron, which had previously faced collapse, was able to regroup. The colonel had saved the line, but at the same time he had crossed an invisible line, that of the chain of command. He did not notify the upper command. He knew he could face court-martial, But inside their barracks, the operators already knew what they had seen. The effectiveness was unquestionable. On the battlefield, a new doctrine was emerging there. It was no longer necessary to adjust the blasting time manually. The radar did it on its own. The miscalculations disappeared. Safe zones no longer exist. Each shot with a proximity fuse was equivalent to 10 ordinary projectiles, and with much less logistical waste. From that moment on, reports began to spread among the artillery groups. Something had changed, and when the impact of this new weapon reached Supreme Headquarters, the military bureaucracy was forced to give in. 3 days later, on December 19th, Eisenhower would formally request the full use of fuses in ground combat. On the 21st, the restrictions were lifted. Eifelson's decision was no longer an act of insubordination. It became the new official policy. What began as an individual risk has become the new standard of warfare. The irony is evident. While the Germans were planning an operation based on bad weather and the absence of air support, the Americans had already fielded technology that ignored the weather and made the sky irrelevant. The Nazi generals still operated under the logic of 1940. But by December 1944, the United States was already struggling with weapons of the future. And that same week, at another point along the line, the Waffen-SS elite would find out what that really meant. The secret behind the new American weapon was not in the explosive, but in what activated it. Unlike ordinary fuses, which exploded on impact or after a pre-calculated time, proximity fuses operated on a radically new principle. They detonated on their own, in the air, when they identified their distance from the target. Each carried within him a miniature radar system. It was the first smart sensor in military history. It was the size of a coffee can, but it housed more than 130 components, resistors, capacitors, transmitters, and up to 5 miniaturized vacuum tubes, specifically designed to withstand the impossible. When fired, the projectile went through an acceleration of 20,000 times the force of gravity. Any ordinary circuit would fall apart, but not that one. During the flight, the small radar emitted continuous waves between 180 and 220 milliwatts. When these waves reflected back intensely, a sign that the projectile was approaching the ground, a tank or a group of soldiers, the system triggered the detonation at the ideal point. The result was devastating. The fragmentation happened in the air, not on impact, and the effect was multiplied. The death cone covered 2 to 3 times more area than a conventional projectile. No trench was deep enough, no natural shelter resisted, but the most impressive thing was not what the device did. It was the fact that the Germans did not believe he existed. In December 1944, Wehrmacht troops captured an American depot containing about 20,000 shells with proximity fuses. The specimens were sent to technical laboratories in Berlin. What was seen there was described by a German engineer as too theatrical to be functional. Vacuum tubes inside a projectile? The official assessment was that the internal components must be fake or part of a rudimentary magnetic detonation mechanism. The idea that a radar could fit inside an artillery shell was for them technically impossible. This conclusion was not born of ignorance, but of arrogance. Even before the war began, German companies such as AEG and Rheinmetall had begun research on similar devices based on electrostatics. The 1940 tests indicated a 95% success rate in controlled environments. But the program was terminated by a direct order from Hitler. No weapons that took more than 6 months to produce were to continue in development. The reasoning was simple and catastrophic. The Third Reich could not wait. Strategic urgency has killed the technological future. Meanwhile, in the United States, the research remained in absolute secrecy. Under the leadership of physicist Merle Tuve, the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory operated under the guise of an abandoned dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland. There, more than 3% of all physicists in the United States were allocated to uninterrupted shifts, focused exclusively on miniaturizing radio tubes until they fit inside a warhead. To do so, they had to completely redesign the principles of electronics. Conventional vacuum tubes, fragile, sensitive, and large, have been reduced to structures smaller than a school rubber, but tough enough to withstand the 3,000-degree Fahrenheit heat at the barrel outlet and operate at sub-zero temperatures at the peak of the trajectory. Each tube had to rotate at thousands of revolutions per minute, without breaking, without failing. What's more, he had to decide on his own when to activate the explosive. Nothing like it had been done before. American engineering didn't just create a technical miracle, it created an industry standard. Mass production was started in parallel with testing. By 1944, more than 100 factories were converted exclusively to fuse manufacturing. Crosley has ditched its refrigerators. Emerson left the home radio line. RCA, General Electric and Sylvania delivered parts with surgical precision. Each batch underwent double testing. Each solder joint was examined with a magnifying glass. Any anomaly, no matter how small, led to the complete disposal of the component. The goal was reliability above 80%. The result? More than 22 million proximity fuses produced by the end of the war. In the Battle of the Bulge alone, 200,000 were fired, and each of them did the work of 10. For soldiers on the front line, it was no longer necessary to wait for the fine-tuning of the artillery. It was not necessary to calculate the time of the wick. It was not necessary to see the target. The ammunition did all this on its own. Observers reported impacts with unprecedented precision. Enemy troops that would previously have survived by spreading out into the woods were now struck inside the forest itself. In captured accounts, German soldiers said that the sound came from above as if the trees were exploding. The collapse of traditional combat doctrine began there. The Germans were faced with a weapon they did not understand, because they had refused their own version years earlier. And even with physical evidence in hand, they continued to deny its functional existence. Germany lost, among other reasons, because it did not believe that something so small could contain so much power, and that would be just the beginning. The next German line to face the new artillery would be the most confident of all, veterans of the Eastern Front, grouped together to crush a small American squadron in the heart of the Mona Forest. What they would find there would not only be resistance, it would be a science that killed in silence. On December 16, 1944, in the immediate vicinity of the small village of Mona, north of Monchaux, the American front line trembled. It was the beginning of the German offensive in the Ardennes, and the first impacts were devastating. The 326th Volksgrenadier Division, composed largely of veterans of the Eastern Front, was advancing with confidence. They had already withstood the siege of Leningrad, the Russian winter, and the brutality of Kursk. But there, in the icy forest of Mona, they would encounter an enemy for which they were not prepared. Ahead of him, defending the sector with limited resources, was the American 38th Reconnaissance Cavalry Squadron, a light, poorly armed unit positioned for observation, not direct combat. German military logic provided for a quick sweep. The American line was considered symbolic, a formality. The Grenadiers advanced in dense formation, with minimal cover and maximum confidence. It was the traditional pattern for forcing the rupture of fragile lines: speed, volume, and psychological impact. And for a few minutes, it looked like it would work, until the American artillery fired, but not with conventional projectiles. At that time, in direct disobedience to orders from above, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson had already authorized the use of the first proximity fuses on European soil. The sound of the firing was familiar, the whistling of artillery cutting through the sky. But what happened next did not fit the known patterns of the war. The explosions were not coming from the ground, but from the air. Above the German formations at a height of 30 to 50 feet, the shells detonated with geometric precision. Shrapnel cut through the mist and silence, ricocheting against trees, branches, and bodies. There was no safe zone. Neither trenches nor ditches nor the natural protection of the forest could contain the lethal geometry of the new weaponry. The veteran soldiers, accustomed to withstanding bombardments for days, were surprised by the unprecedented nature of the attack. The pattern of survival, duck, protect, wait, has failed. Instead of protection, the shelter amplified the impact. Broken branches became secondary projectiles, hitting at deadly speeds. The ice-covered leaves hid hot fragments. The accounts of prisoners captured that morning reveal the panic. We didn't know where it came from. We were being shot down before we even saw the enemy. There was no prior warning, neither visual nor audible. Just a growing hiss and then aerial fragmentation. Those who survived spoke of a storm of needles, a burst of dry thunder, and the air closing in on us. Psychologically, the impact was immediate. Highly trained troops retreated, hesitated, broke through formation. The planned attack to crush the 38th Squadron was halted not by infantry resistance, but by unseen calculations programmed within shells. The mathematics of artillery had changed. American artillery, hitherto seen as a supporting weapon, now became the central element of defense. She didn't expect visual orders. She decided on her own, and with that, he redefined the very logic of the battlefield. The forest, once a German tactical refuge, now behaved like a trap. What the manuals taught as natural protection became the most dangerous scenario possible. The wood multiplied into splinters. The high canopies became flashpoints. Each tree served as a surface for dispersal. German numerical superiority was nullified by a variable not foreseen on war maps: autonomous sensors and smart ammunition. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Germany had tested detonation fuses even before the Americans and cancelled the project. Now he buried his own men under exploding trees. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content like this, straight from the forgotten fronts of history. The result in Mona was immediate. The offensive stalled, not by total destruction but by utter confusion. Wehrmacht radios reported invisible resistance, intelligent bombing, aerial fire without planes. It was the first direct record of the new war, and the prelude to what would happen in the hills of Elsenborn, where even the SS elite would surrender to the power of heaven. Between December 17th and 19th, 1944, in the Elsenborn Hills sector, the clash was no longer just a dispute over territory, and became a collision between two ways of thinking about war. On one side, the elite of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler considered the best-trained, ideologically committed, and fanatically loyal shock troop of the Third Reich. On the other, the American 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions, composed largely of inexperienced soldiers, some on their first campaign, positioned at high points with limited support. German doctrine predicted that Elsenborn would be taken in the first hours of the offensive. The maps plotted the routes to Bastogne and Antwerp from there. The panzers advanced confidently, following the playbook: mass offensive, armored support, infantry in close formation. What they found, however, was something that no manual predicted. The American artillery, positioned in a defensive semicircle, was waiting with hundreds of howitzers loaded with ammunition equipped with proximity fuses. The terrain helped. The hills allowed for wide shooting angles, and the dense vegetation created natural traps. But what made the difference wasn't the number of cannons, it was the intelligence contained in each shell. The 2nd Division fired more than 160,000 rounds in just 3 days. About 25% of these munitions used VT fuses. Although they were only a quarter of the shots, they accounted for approximately 60% of German casualties in the region. The statistic revealed a new truth. Firepower was no longer measured in volume, but in accuracy and efficiency. American dams had no fixed standard. They did not follow the rhythm. They were unpredictable, fast, lethal. When a German platoon entered the firing line, the sensors did the rest. The projectiles went up, captured the distance, exploded at the ideal point. Aerial fragmentation covered entire areas without allowing time for dispersion. What had once been a tactical advantage, the SS wedge formation, the concentrated advance, was now a death sentence. American observers, positioned at the highest points of the hills, reported German waves dissolving on the impact of the dams. Entire platoons disappeared. At several points, bodies piled up on such steep slopes that succeeding units were forced to scale their own dead to follow the advance. The psychological effect was immediate and profound. The 1st SS, trained to withstand everything, began to hesitate. What had once been a certainty, that the Reich would win by discipline and brutality, now crumbled in the face of an enemy that could not be hit. The American artillery was not there, in sight. It was invisible, impersonal, mathematical, a system operating from a distance, guided by calculations and sensors that decided when and where to kill. SS officers shouted to reorganize the lines, but tactical cohesion had evaporated. Many soldiers began to retreat before reaching the American positions. The doctrine of moral, physical, and racial superiority encountered, for the first time, an obstacle that did not react to brute force. It reacted to presence. All you had to do was enter the range sector, and the sky exploded. The indoctrination that had prepared these men to withstand cold, hunger, and siege did not prepare them to fight a weapon that seemed to know where they were before they even set foot on the ground. The panic was not just physical, it was conceptual. The elite troops, accustomed to inspiring fear, began to fear him. Elsenborn marked the beginning of the ideological collapse of the SS in the Ardennes. What was designed as a breaking point on the American front turned into a military graveyard. Germany did not lose for lack of courage. He lost by relying too much on his own dogmas. Blind faith in attack doctrine, superior training, and hierarchical structure could not withstand a projectile with internal radar. The Nazi generals watched from afar, not knowing how to react. There was no countermeasure to that, and as they tried to adapt their tactics, American artillery began to use proximity fuses on another critical front, the defense of a surrounded dead-end and surrender-free city, Bastogne, December 1944. A vital crossroads in the Ardennes, surrounded on all sides by German forces determined to crush the American 101st Airborne Division. The troops were isolated, with no supply line, with the weather making it impossible to provide air support and ammunition stocks at critical levels. The German command believed that victory was a matter of hours. But this assessment ignored a determining factor, the silent presence of a specific type of ammunition, kept until then as a strategic asset, projectiles with proximity fuses. Among the artillerymen assigned to protect the city's perimeter was the 463rd Parachute Artillery Battalion, armed with 75mm howitzers. At its side, the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit, operated 155mm howitzers. Together, these two formations represented a rare combination of technical innovation and human resilience. As the encirclement intensified, American positions became increasingly pressured, but the answer did not come with ground reinforcements, nor with aerial bombardments. It came from the sky, but not in the shape of an airplane, but in steel shells that exploded dozens of feet above the ground, without warning, with astonishing precision. Between December 19th and 31, the 463rd Battalion fired more than 7,600 shells. While not all of them had proximity fuses, those that did had devastating effects. German columns, accustomed to protecting themselves from artillery fire by diving into trenches or retreating into the woods, now found that there was no possible shelter. The sky, once a neutral element, had become the enemy. Explosions at altitude created cones of lethal fragments that decimated entire formations, even those on the march or dispersed. For the 101st, surrounded, poorly fed, exhausted, and facing sub-zero temperatures, the difference between resistance and annihilation was in those seconds of technological anticipation. Each radar-equipped shell compensated for dozens of additional soldiers. The enemy no longer needed to be seen. Science did it for them. The city resisted, not because it had more soldiers, but because it had the right kind of ammunition at the right time. The 969th Battalion, with its 155mm howitzers, contributed an even deeper layer of destruction. Their larger charges and wider angles of fire allowed them to create kill zones around Bastogne, invisible cordons that prevented German forces from approaching. Each shot detonating at 50 feet high multiplied the lethality by a factor of 5 compared to conventional ammunition. And most ironically, many of the German soldiers advancing toward Bastogne, under the cloak of racial and tactical superiority taught by Nazi propaganda, were being held by units made up of African Americans, men who, in the United States itself, still faced institutional discrimination. Equality had not yet been achieved at home, but on the battlefield, the logic was different. Competence and technology determined the value of a unit. The symbiosis between electronic ingenuity and operational courage created an invisible line of defense, where weather, which the Germans believed to be their greatest advantage, became irrelevant. Zero visibility? Irrelevant. The absence of aerial reconnaissance? Unnecessary. Proximity sensors did not require eyes, only targets, and they found them, invariably. On December 22nd, when the Germans demanded the formal surrender of the American garrison, General Anthony McAuliffe's response was laconic. Nuts! That bravado, by itself, would not stop a panzer division, but beneath it was an artillery system that turned every enemy advance into a sentence of destruction. And it wasn't just physical destruction that undermined the Wehrmacht, it was the panic induced by a gun that didn't need to be seen, didn't need to be guided, didn't need to wait. The troops surrounding Bastogne reported outbreaks of disobedience, spontaneous retreats, and increased psychological casualties. Captured prisoners later confessed that they did not know what they were facing, only that the sky was exploding, and there was no way to react. The Battle of Bastogne became the symbol of American resistance, not only for the tenacity of its defenders, but for the debut of a new type of supremacy, that of intelligent artillery. From then on, the question for the Germans was no longer how to break the encirclement, but how to survive the approach. Winter continued, and on the horizon, farther south, a commander known for despising defense and idolizing attack was approaching. George S. Patton was marching his Third Army toward Bastogne, and he was about to apply proximity fuses with even more accurate mathematics. General George S. Patton was not known for patience. He was the kind of commander who preferred tanks on the move to strategy meetings, but when he arrived on the bank of the Sauer River in January 1945, he witnessed something that made him fall silent. Before his eyes, a German battalion was attempting to cross the frozen river, part of a desperate attempt to reconstruct lines after the collapse of the Ardennes offensive. The move was neither bold nor strategic. It was a retreat. Hurried men, light vehicles, overloaded trucks and soldiers dragging ammunition over improvised planks. The kind of action that, in another era, would only be observed. But there, on that improvised bridge, the new weight of modern warfare fell. The battery of the American 333rd Artillery Battalion, positioned miles away, received the exact coordinates. There was no hesitation. In less than 3 minutes, 24 shells were fired, all equipped with proximity fuses. The internal sensors detected the ideal moment of explosion before it even hit the ground, and what followed was a sequence of aerial detonations that turned the river into a clearing of fire and steel. The shrapnel didn't just hit the bodies, it pierced trucks, shattered crates of ammunition, set fuel on fire, broke the bridge structure. In 5 minutes, there was no longer a bridge. There was no more training. The official number recorded later was 702 soldiers killed or wounded, all in a single attack. No direct shot, no exchange of fire, just calculation, distance, and the previous silence of mathematics being broken by a millimetrically orchestrated impact. For Patton, known for his obsession with mobility and maneuvering tactics, that scene changed everything. Artillery with proximity fuses, he would write days later, was the decisive factor in this land war. No progress is possible against this type of fire. But the Germans still did not understand the dimension of what they were facing. Their maps still indicated areas of cover. Their doctrines still provided for dispersion as a form of survival. But against radar-enabled aerial fragmentation, these solutions were ineffective. Every American shot killed before the combat even began. What's more, American factories were already producing 40,000 of these fuses a day. By comparison, the Third Reich never produced more than 6,000 electronic fuses a month, and almost all of them were intended for torpedoes or V-1 missiles, not field artillery. If this data surprises you, comment with "logistics wins" or "absolute power." Their interaction helped spread this story and reveal what was hidden in the books. The massacre on the Sauer River was not just a tactical victory, it was a warning. War was no longer a confrontation of courage, and was turning into a duel of technical capabilities. The best-trained soldier in the Wehrmacht could not resist a projectile that he thought of for himself, and that was just the beginning. Behind the scenes, as shells exploded in the forests of Belgium and the valleys of Luxembourg, another conflict intensified, the internal clash between generals who wanted to control the new weapon and officers who could no longer fight without it. At the height of the Ardennes offensive, as German tanks tried to break through enemy lines, and infantry advanced under heavy fire, a parallel operation sought to sow chaos behind American defenses. It was Operation Greif, conceived by Otto Skorzeny, the most famous SS commando, known for having rescued Mussolini from the Apennines with a boldness that bordered on fiction. Now he led a special force of German saboteurs, trained to infiltrate disguised as American soldiers. Wearing captured uniforms, authentic jeeps, and rehearsed accented English, the objective was clear: to infiltrate communications, redirect traffic, blow up ammunition depots, and disrupt the Allied counterattack. Many of these commandos were special operations veterans, trained to withstand pressure, improvise under fire, and move in the dim light of enemy lines. But what they didn't know and couldn't predict is that they wouldn't die for their human failings. They would die because of a variable that was not included in the infiltration manuals: the automated calculation of American artillery. On 21st December, a group of Skorzenys advancing in convoy along a side road northeast of Malmedy was identified by advance observers of the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division. The movement seemed American, but the gait pattern and steering raised suspicions. The coordinates were transmitted. The howitzers of the 333rd Artillery Battalion opened fire with a mixed barrage, part with conventional fuses, part with proximity fuses. The shells flew for 12 kilometers and began fragmentation 40 feet above the road. The effect was instantaneous. What was supposed to be a covert operation was turned into a red-hot line of destruction. Jeeps exploded in sequence, tires on fire, ammunition detonating inside the compartments. The soldiers, dressed as Americans, ran off the road, but the sensors did not distinguish nationality or tactical plan. They detected only presence, density, and range. Of the 44 men in the original group, 31 died on the spot. The survivors, wounded and disoriented, were captured. None of them had been able to carry out even a sabotage mission. The episode would be repeated over the following days. Small groups of commandos attempted to move between the Stavelot and Trois Ponts sectors, but all attempts crossed areas covered by defensive barrages. Electronic sensors eliminated the traditional advantage of infiltration, the human factor. It didn't matter the cunning nor the disguise. The war there was no longer a duel between minds. It was a fight against automated equations. What surprised Allied intelligence analysts was not only the failure of Skorzeny actions, but the efficiency with which these elite troops were destroyed in the open, even when operating outside of conventional combat. The doctrine of special warfare, built on flexibility, invisibility, and surgical precision, had found an enemy that operated outside of these logics. The enemy was a vacuum tube with a radar. It was the VT fuse. In the post-war period, during interrogations at Nuremberg, an officer subordinate to Skorzeny summed up the episode bitterly. "We trained men for months, prepared the route, uniform, password, but all it took was one sensor in the sky to end it all." The silence that followed the destruction of Operation Greif was not only tactical, it was symbolic. Neither the best men in the Reich nor its infiltrated elite could break through a barrier created by civil engineers in America's anonymous laboratories, and that would be just the harbinger of an even bigger transformation. Plans to adapt proximity fuses to anti-aircraft defense, where the target did not march but flew at 600 km/h. On the morning of December 25, 1944, the snows of the Ardennes were tinged with red. Christmas dawned dense with thick fog, the sky closed and the sound of German engines being started cautiously in hidden clearings. On the side of the Wehrmacht, it was expected, if not a formal truce, at least an implicit pause. There was a tradition in past wars, even in the First World War, that Christmas suspended the fighting, even if only for a few hours. It was the day when field kitchens were reactivated, troops reorganized, and commanders adjusted their lines. But that December 25th would mark a definitive turning point, the proof that modern warfare did not respect symbols, only systems. In the southern sector of Hubris, 3 German battalions in the replenishment phase received artillery fire at about 9:15 a.m. There were no American observers in sight, no tactical movement had been recorded. Even so, the howitzers fell with precision, detonating at an average height of 40 feet and generating nearly symmetrical fragmentation fields. The Germans were out in the open, in scattered formation, dismantling guns, rearranging supplies, distributing meals. The result was catastrophic. The fog that was supposed to guarantee anonymity only served to mask the impersonal advance of the electronic sensor. Witnesses reported explosions out of nowhere, without warning, and a widespread sense that death no longer had logic. Losses exceeded 500 men in less than 30 minutes, many of whom did not carry weapons. They carried lunchboxes. American artillery, guided by sensors, no longer required line of sight. It operated in the dark, in the cold, in silence. His only condition was the presence of the target. It was as if the very existence of the enemy soldiers triggered their fury. In St. Vith, a German armored formation stationed near the N62 road came under another withering attack in the mid-afternoon. Around the tanks, mechanics did maintenance, operators slept inside the vehicles, and officers sketched maps. At 3:40 p.m., a barrage of VT-fused shells hit them head-on, destroying 12 Panzer IV tanks, damaging another 20 vehicles, and killing more than 200 soldiers within seconds. There was no maneuver. There was no reaction. The surprise was not only in the attack, but in the timing. It was Christmas, and the Germans understood too late that the new war was not conducted by men, it was run by systems. The internal radar of the projectiles did not distinguish the 24 from the 25. He did not recognize symbols nor hierarchy. What the soldiers called the human interval, the system defined as optimal impact time. That logic was new and relentless. In the diary of a German officer captured in Mannheim, it reads, "We expected respect, we received calculations." American intelligence did not stop its attacks. On the contrary, he took advantage of the tactical carelessness of the date to launch surgical attacks. The 402nd Field Artillery Battalion, positioned north of Bastogne, fired 5,800 shells on the 25th, 1,200 of which were equipped with proximity fuses. In one of the most accurate operations of the campaign, it neutralized 3 German command points and destroyed an entire communications network without ever seeing the enemy. This is the lesson that was marked on the soil of the Ardennes. War had divorced itself from human emotions. Commemorative dates, codes of honor, gestures of nobility, all of these were part of an earlier era. Now the advantage was with those who mastered the logic of frequencies, circuits, electronic miniaturization. The machine felt no pity. It just detected and detonated. Over the next few days, the morale of the German troops dropped to historic levels. Accounts of soldiers refusing to group up, of officers who forbade formations even under direct orders, and of radio operators asking permission to move in units of 2 or 3, reveal that the psychological impact of December 25th was greater than any explosion. The very idea of front line began to crumble. The front was now in the air, and the air the Americans had turned into a weapon. But while the Germans buried their Christmas dead in blood, another kind of quiet preparation took place in distant factories across the ocean. Assembly lines were about to produce not thousands, but millions of these devices. And with that, the next phase of the war would cease to be terrestrial and would return to the skies. For centuries, European armies learned to hide, ambush, and resist within the forests. From the Napoleonic rebels to the camouflage trenches of World War I, the forest was the perfect shelter. It muffled sound, concealed movement, and provided natural cover against observers and aircraft. For German military doctrine, this was an absolute truth. The Ardennes in 1944 was not just terrain, it was strategy. Hitler had chosen the region precisely for this reason. The forest density would prevent full use of Allied aviation, limit visibility, and create an ambush advantage for experienced divisions like the 6th SS Panzer Army. And for a few days, it seemed that the logic would hold. Early German offensives succeeded in infiltrating units between the logs, breaking through lines, and creating confusion. But there was one detail that no one in the Wehrmacht had foreseen, a variable that wasn't in the tactical manuals. Proximity fuses didn't have to see, they just felt it. And above the canopies, the sensors did the rest. When the Americans began firing their howitzers equipped with VT fuses over the dense forests, the paradigm was reversed. What was once a shelter has become a trap. Detonations at altitude didn't just dump fragments in free fall, they interacted with their own environment. The thick branches of the trees, once allies, were now transformed into secondary shards. A projectile that exploded 15 meters high multiplied its fragmentation with the help of the surroundings. Each tree, each broken branch, generated new vectors of death. The result was an effect known to soldiers as rain of razors. German troops would enter the forest for cover and emerge torn apart when they could emerge. In sectors such as Bühlingen and Honsfeld, the 12th SS Division Hitlerjugend attempted to regroup in isolated clearings, hidden under the canopies, to prepare a new advance. The Americans, detecting the displacement, launched a programmed barrage with VT sensors. The howitzers exploded over the vegetation, and the trunks, some more than 30 centimeters in diameter, were broken in half. On the field, the casualties were not only human. The draft horses, the field radios, the light weapons, everything was pulverized. The forest roared. What was once invisibility has become an echo. What was once silence has become death. The irony was brutal. The same doctrine that had taught the Germans to use the forest as a cloak now led them straight into the perfect trap. The commanders tried to adapt, but the collapse was epistemological. It was not just a matter of logistics. It was a failure of knowledge. The old tactic, learned, memorized, and applied for generations, had been overtaken by a projectile that altered the logic of the terrain. There was no point in seeking shade anymore. The shadow now multiplied the shards. By the end of December, Allied intelligence intercepted desperate messages from German units, requesting immediate evacuation of forest positions. A commander of the 560th Volksgrenadier reported, "The trees explode. Heaven doesn't need to see us. He just feels us." The phrase spread among the reports. It epitomized the new kind of terror, invisible, automatic, impersonal. The army that sought camouflage met with destruction. The forest, once a refuge, was now the biggest risk. The statistics confirmed the change. More than 70% of German casualties in certain sectors came from aerial artillery, not direct confrontation. And of these, more than half were caused by projectiles with proximity fuses. It was the end of the war as we knew it. But as the Wehrmacht reaped the remnants of an overturned doctrine, another, even more painful lesson loomed. Americans had learned to modulate these weapons for even more specific purposes. The next phase of the war would not only be airborne, it would be guided by different calibers and hunted in the sky itself. Even before Pearl Harbor, even before the Blitzkriegs devastated Western Europe, a small group of engineers in Nazi Germany had already stumbled upon what would later change the course of the war: the idea of a fuse capable of detecting the proximity of the target and detonating before impact. The research, begun quietly in 1938 by AEG in partnership with Rheinmetall, aimed to create an electrostatic field detonation system. In restricted trials from 1940, prototypes demonstrated up to 95% reliability against static targets and promising results in anti-aircraft defense simulations. However, the proposal still required development, miniaturization, and time, something Hitler despised with increasing fervor. Obsessed with weapons with immediate effect, the Führer issued a clear directive: projects that did not deliver practical results within 6 months would be considered obstacles to victory. Science came to be seen as an instrument of propaganda, not of strategy, and so at a high-level meeting of the Ministry of Armaments, the proximity fuse project was shelved, not because of technical unfeasibility, but because of political impatience. At the same time, in the United States, a team led by Merle Tuve and scientists from the National Defense Research Committee accepted just the opposite, that war required industrial predictability, scientific patience, and long-term vision. While the Germans cancelled research because it did not give immediate results, the Americans invested millions in laboratories that would take years to produce the first functional unit. Hitler's decision would be costly. By 1944, the US was producing more than 22,000 proximity fuses a day, while Germany had not even returned to the drawing board. For those who underestimated the impact of this choice, one statistic reveals the scale of the defeat. Of all the projectiles fired by the US in the Battle of the Bulge, about 25% used VT fuses, but that 25% accounted for nearly 60% of German casualties, an efficiency ratio that is simply impossible with conventional fuses. If this surprises you, comment on "shocking data" or "logistics wins." The development of a single electronic component, neglected by Germany for seeming slow, became the most advanced weapon of the conflict. And the final irony: when capturing fragments of American projectiles, German engineers initially refused to believe that that circuit could fit inside a projectile. One of them recorded, "This is not possible. No radar system can withstand 20,000 G." They were right, within the bounds of what they knew, but the boundaries had changed. The German defeat at that point was no longer just on the field. He was an intellectual, and this technical failure, along with arrogance, would be even more evident on the next front, when American shells would no longer hit infantry columns, but enemy aircraft in mid-flight. At the heart of the American effort during World War II was a different kind of battlefront. It was not delimited by trenches, nor mapped by generals. It was made up of hundreds of factories, spread across states such as Indiana, Ohio, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. There, far from the roar of cannons and the cold of the Ardennes, a war of precision was won by anonymous hands. Civilians, mostly women, many immigrants, recruited en masse for a task they did not fully understand, but carried out with an almost military discipline. The secrecy was absolute. Every 2 seconds, a new proximity fuse unit rolled off the assembly line. Production was distributed among more than 100 facilities, in a system designed not only to scale, but to endure. Factories such as Crosley Corporation, RCA, Sylvania, and Emerson were quickly converted to meet demand. Home radio assemblers became centers of war engineering. Many workers knew that they were working on a top-secret project, but they did not know that each piece assembled by their hands decided the life or death of hundreds at the front. To ensure secrecy, the project was compartmentalized. A worker was welding contact terminals without knowing that it was part of a miniature radar. Another group set timers to millisecond accuracy without knowing their use. Only the chief engineers, at rare levels of access, understood the final product. The complexity was brutal. Each fuse had to withstand an acceleration force of more than 20,000 G on the trip, withstand vibration, extreme temperature, and still operate a functional electronic circuit with microwave sensors and battery power. At each batch, samples were selected and subjected to impact and precision tests. If a batch failed, it was all discarded. There was no margin for error. While Germany patched up bombed facilities, relocated factories to tunnels and caves, and tried to keep artisanal production under constant attack, the US achieved an almost invisible feat: the creation of a highly complex industry in record time, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was a war won without firing a single bullet, but one that ensured that when the bullet was fired, it would find its target with scientific perfection. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States produced more than 22 million proximity fuses. Each unit was a miracle of engineering, but also a triumph of organization. There was no solitary genius. There was process, coordination, line, rhythm, and within that, a merciless logic. The Germans were fighting a machine that wouldn't stop, a silent army dressed in civilian uniforms and confined between presses and benches, transformed technological advantage into numerical supremacy. Germany, which had led the world in electronics in the 1930s, now watched helplessly as its own defeat industrialized. The chief engineer of the German project, abandoned in 1940, wrote after the war, "We have not been outdone in ideas. We were surpassed in the system." And that was exactly it. The American victory was not just the result of a new weapon, but of the ability to build, test, and deliver that weapon with a constancy that no Axis power could replicate. And the most impressive thing, all this took place in silence. Factories did not appear in propaganda films. The workers did not know the names of the battles they were winning. But every 2 seconds, a shell was assembled, packed, and sent to the front, where it would become the response that no German general could predict. In the next chapter, we will look at the ultimate impact of this industrial machine, how it not only defeated armies, but went on to rewrite the rules of air combat. Because the fuses that swept through forests, now they would be pointed to heaven. While many generals were still groping in the dark in the face of the new technology, 2 names in the United States Army were 10 steps ahead: George S. Patton and Edward H. "Ted" Williams. Patton, with his legendary aggressiveness and disdain for hesitation, was one of the first commanders to not only accept proximity fuses, but to shape their use in the field with impressive speed. At his side, Brigadier General Edward Williams, artillery commander of the Third Army, realized that the new weapon was not just a tactical advantage, it was a revolution in the doctrine of the use of fire. Williams understood that projectiles should no longer be used as a response to enemy movements, but as an instrument of terrain denial, and that if coordinated with mathematical precision, they could impede any attempt at advance, even without the presence of visible troops. He transformed the artillery from a complementary support into a protagonist. Dams are now calculated in 3 dimensions: depth, elevation, and time. Each salvo was designed not only to destroy, but to break morale and prevent regrouping. The rate of fire was restructured. Instead of spaced shots came synchronized bursts. Several batteries fired simultaneously, creating a ceiling of explosions that hung over entire sectors for minutes at a time. The fuse sensors did the rest. There was no more warning shot. Each shell was a decisive strike. The previous doctrine, based on zones of impact on the ground, was abandoned. Now the battlefield was a lethal air volume. The mere approach of enemy troops became suicide. Williams established a new protocol: saturation preemptive triggering. The logic was simple. If there was suspicion of German concentration, even without visual confirmation, the artillery launched a barrage with VT fuses. The projectile exploded over the area, hitting any living thing within a radius of 15 to 30 meters. The margin of error was minimal. The margin of survival is even smaller. Patton, with his characteristic aggressiveness, applied this doctrine with ferocity. In a conference with his commanders in December 1944, he declared, "I want every grove occupied by the enemy to be swept away like a pig pen. The shells will clear the brush before my men enter." The order was complied with. At each movement of the German infantry, the Americans responded with an anticipated curtain of fire. The war began to be fought before rifle shots were heard, and while the Germans were still trying to understand how those explosions worked, the Americans were already using variations in load time and firing pattern. The artillery is no longer reactive. She became proactive. You didn't shoot to answer. You shot to prevent. In an internal report of the Third Army General Staff, Williams wrote, "We are for the first time imposing a mathematical veto on the enemy's advance." The phrase, "almost cold," hid the profound impact of the change. German commanders trained in the Clausewitzian doctrine of maneuver could no longer find anywhere to maneuver. There was no flank. There was no loophole. The sky, saturated with sensors, had become the new enemy, and the contrast with the German high command was stark. While the Americans were already testing fuses adapted to different calibers and weather conditions, Wehrmacht generals were still drafting reports trying to understand the new type of explosive howitzer that seemed to choose its targets. Germany was still looking for mystical explanations for what the Americans had turned into factory routine. German Lieutenant Colonel Fritz Bayerlein, a prisoner after the Battle of the Bulge, summed it up with bitter irony. "They are not just outsmarting us, they are anticipating us." And indeed they were. The domain of the new doctrine was not only technological, it was mental. War was now made up of predictions, ballistic tables adjusted by engineers, decisions made from simple but ruthless algorithms. The art of killing had become a science, and whoever tried to face it with courage and trenches, he would only find silence followed by shrapnel. The next front, however, would put this system to the test as never before. The enemy would come from the skies, and the fuses would be challenged to prove that they could also hunt the invisible in mid-flight. In the early weeks of the Ardennes offensive, the Nazi war machine still believed in its own myth. Waffen-SS troops, indoctrinated from their youth in ideals of physical superiority and blind obedience, marched with the conviction that winter, terrain, and surprise played in their favor. But confidence began to crumble, not in the face of tanks or bombers, but in the face of a muffled sound followed by silence. And then aerial fragmentation. What would come later was not in the manuals. Whole troops ceased to advance, not out of fear of the visible enemy, but out of terror of the invisible. Between 24 and 27th December, in the St. Vith region, units of the 9th SS Panzer Division reported massive losses after night deployment attempts. What the commanders called the safe zone, dense woods and shrouded valleys, had become a suspended slaughterhouse. American artillery, positioned more than 10 kilometers away, used proximity fuses with maps updated by aerial reconnaissance and sound triangulation. There was no need for a direct look. Mathematics decided the moment and the point of impact. And science fulfilled the sentence. The result was not only lethal, it was psychological. SS soldiers, trained to resist to the death, began to hesitate. In sectors under constant cover of aerial fire, command posts received reports of unauthorized retreat. Entire platoons dispersed without a fight. The most emblematic case occurred near Mannheim, when a group of about 70 soldiers of the 12th SS Hitler Jugend was found by American troops already surrendered without exchanging fire. When questioned, one of the prisoners, only 19 years old, declared, "Heaven is against us. It's like dying without knowing where you came from." The phrase, although simple, summed up the collapse of an entire system. Nazi doctrine was based on raw courage, forged moral superiority, and the belief that willpower could overcome any obstacle. But there was no trench against sensors. There was no ideology against electronics. The collapse was therefore symbolic. The Waffen-SS, the ultimate symbol of the combat elite, began to crumble in the face of what it could not even comprehend. The commanders tried to impose discipline, threatening shootings for desertion, but fear had overcome fanaticism. An American officer recorded in the 30th Division's campaign diary, "Today we captured 112 SS men in a single position. They did not fight. They were in shock. Some were crying." The cycle was reversed. Nazi propaganda promised terror to enemies, But now it was it that produced panic. Combat psychology, hitherto ignored by Wehrmacht strategists, showed its weight. And the impact was profound. With no confidence in the shelter, no prediction of the attack, no control over the battlefield, even the most indoctrinated soldiers broke. It was not the defeat of an army, it was the collapse of a belief. The irony of this story is that the solution has always been before them. But pride prevented adaptation. If you're enjoying unraveling these hidden layers of war, like and subscribe. Your support keeps this reconstruction of the facts alive, because history is not only made of victories, but of decisions. And the next part will reveal how the enemy finally understood the dimension of his mistake. Too late. A captured German intelligence report, dated January 1945, would carry the phrase that would end all the arrogance, "We have no answer to this." The soldiers who crossed the Hürtgen forest may never have known this, but as they ducked before explosions that seemed to pick them by name, they were witnessing the birth of a new era. The same vacuum tubes that detonated projectiles in the air, with tiny sensors and electronic stopwatches invulnerable to impact, would be the seeds of science that would take us beyond the planet. Proximity fuses were not just a weapon, they were a technological leap. The need to create a device that could survive 20,000 times the force of gravity, run on its own power, react to radar signals, and operate in less than a second forced American scientists to miniaturize components, stabilize frequencies, and automate circuits. This effort involved dozens of civilian and military laboratories, among them the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, where a young physicist named James Van Allen was tasked with developing a lightweight, sealed, fast-response vacuum tube. The project worked. The tube resisted the firing and accurately conducted the firing sequence of the proximity sensors, but Van Allen didn't stop there. After the war, he would become one of the central figures in the American space race. And in 1958, its instruments, direct descendants of fuses, would be aboard Explorer 1, the first American satellite to orbit the Earth. It was with these sensors, born to kill, that the world discovered the radiation belts that today bear his name, the Van Allen belts. The technology that once destroyed entire formations under the Ardennes sky now probed the cosmos. The radar that tracked hidden soldiers had become the same one that would track solar particles hundreds of kilometers high. The science of war had crossed the frontier of peace, and the legacy of fuses didn't stop there. The logic of automatic response to the environment, the sensors calibrated by distance and movement, the independent decision circuits, all of this would be transplanted to guided missiles, to nuclear warheads, to planetary probes. Space, once the domain of the unknown, was now read by electronic eyes that had first learned to look at humans. It was the ultimate irony. To understand the sky, humanity had to master it as a weapon. To discover the limits of the Earth, it was first necessary to learn how to make it a deadly precision field. The laboratory where Van Allen perfected the electronic tubes of the fuses would soon receive contracts from the newly created NASA. Many of the engineers who in 1944 calibrated anti-aircraft projectiles at Fort Monroe would be, in 1960, working on navigation algorithms for lunar probes. The knowledge accumulated in silence behind sealed doors was now celebrated at scientific conferences, but the genesis remained. The principles that had saved Elsenborn's flank, which had broken the SS at Bastogne, now made satellites, telescopes, and orbital explorations possible. It was the same circuit, the same mind, the same logic. The world had changed. But the origin of the change, that inaugural spark, that lethal miniature that floated over soldiers with seconds to live, still echoed in the formulas of post-war engineers. The scientist who designed the first operational fuse unit, Merle Tuve, stated decades later, "Everything we have been able to achieve in space began with the question, how do you detonate something without touching it?" The question was answered in combat, but the answer has continued to resonate for generations. And if the Germans had underestimated the depth of the American leap, it was because they did not see what was behind it. A culture that did not despise the long term, that he invested in research with no guarantee of results, that prioritized precision over appearance, that transformed civilian laboratories into a strategic force. And in the end, it was this culture that won the war, and that would later, without fanfare, conquer space. But before the world celebrated rockets and satellites, there would be one last scene in this story, an open field, a German regiment on the march, and a distant sound, which announced that science once again would arrive before the bullets. In the post-war period, among the rubble of a broken empire, the voices of those who had been on the other side of the front began to emerge, no longer surrounded by flags, nor surrounded by shouts of victory, but isolated in cells, interrogations, or bitter memories. And it was in these voices that an unforced confession emerged. Germany's defeat at the Battle of the Bulge was not just a logistical collapse nor a supply failure. It was the result of a war that they no longer knew how to fight. Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded the Western High Command during the offensive, stated in 1946 during interviews with the Allies that the losses caused by American artillery were beyond calculation. There was something new which our observers could not comprehend. Hasso von Manteuffel, the general in charge of the 5th Panzer Army, was even more blunt. We expected a traditional resistance, but we were disintegrated by unprecedented precision. The forest had become our enemy. For generals accustomed to campaigns in the open, such as in France or Russia, the surprise was almost theological. The German doctrine, built on speed, concentration, and aggression, crumbled in the face of artillery that saw without seeing, that killed without aiming, that was always in the right place at the exact second. Many German officials reported suspecting internal espionage at first. They found it impossible for Americans to know their travel routes so accurately. They did not know that the secret was in the projectile itself. The psychological impact was immense. We couldn't move at night or during the day. The sky, even though covered with clouds, seemed to watch us, reported a major of the 116th Panzer Division. The war had changed, and they realized it too late. Post-defeat Wehrmacht analyses even suggested that the Americans were employing some kind of radio-controlled weapon, but they could not find receiving devices in the wreckage. The mystery only increased. The German Artillery Technical Manual, updated in January 1945, warned that American explosions occur before impact with the ground, with irregular air pattern and effects magnified by upward fragmentation. Still, there was no official explanation, just speculations. At the end of the war, British intelligence revealed to the captured Germans the basic workings of the VT fuses, short for variable time fuses, the American name for proximity fuses. The response was silence. A German artillery colonel is reported to have said only, "If only we had known this before, we would have backed off sooner." And here is the bitterest irony of all. While Hitler pressed his generals for further advancement, believing that cloudy skies gave the advantage over American aviation, he ignored that the enemy's real force did not need clear skies, nor of airplanes. It came from the industrial underground, from civil laboratories, from anonymous factories. It was the strength of applied science, strategic patience, invisible logistics. By the time the Nazi generals finally understood what had hit them, the battle was already lost. And more than lost, it was outdated. The war, which they planned as a repeat of 1940, had turned into something neither of them foresaw. The failure, therefore, was not only tactical, it was epistemological. They lost because they didn't understand the kind of war they were facing. And this recognition, coming from the enemy itself, carries a definite moral weight. The American triumph at the Battle of the Bulge was not just the fruit of courage or numbers. It was the victory of knowledge over belief, of science over instinct, of precision over brutality. And the last act was still missing, because the same generals who now admitted defeat, they would witness something even more disconcerting. The weapon that brought them down was not the end of one era, it was the beginning of another. On assembly lines hidden in nameless sheds, silence was a requirement, confidentiality a sentence. Civilian workers, many of them women newly arrived from rural areas, widows, single mothers, immigrants, operated under codes they did not understand, putting on plays they could not discuss, for a destiny they would never see. The factories that fed the proximity fuses operated in uninterrupted relay, 3 shifts a day, 12 hours per day. The mistake was not only dangerous, it was unacceptable. A microscopic short circuit could turn a strategic weapon into failure, and the margin for failure was zero. Every tube, every capacitor, every metal casing was subjected to brutal tests, centrifugation, vibration, impact. None of these women knew the battlefield, but they had learned to replicate under pressure the procedures that kept soldiers alive. It was war without trenches, a precision war with tired hands. Many of these workers never figured out exactly what they were building. The order was clear. Don't ask, just ride. But rumors were spreading. The explosions in the field tests, the interest of military intelligence, the results released behind closed doors, everything indicated that something unprecedented was being put into practice. And with that came the weight. Nervous breakdowns, physical collapses, silences that lasted decades. The design of proximity fuses was one of the most secret of World War II, more secret than radar, at times more restricted than the Manhattan Project. The psychological impact of this secret was devastating. Workers developed hand tremors, memory lapses, insomnia. There were reports of workers who, after years of repetitive work, could no longer sleep without hearing the metallic cracks of the fittings in sequence. They did not carry weapons, but they carried the weight of those that would be fired. The irony, deep and silent, is that the most accurate weapon of war was created by those who never received military instruction. One of the most sophisticated devices in war engineering was born on wooden tables, with screws tightened by hand, by people who would be ignored in strategy books. An RCA technician, in a confidential report, wrote, "We have illiterate women assembling sensors that are more sensitive than our best oscillators." It was an industrial feat, but also a human drama. The Allied victory was sustained in part by the work of those who never heard a shot, but lived under the strain of each of them. Every fuse produced was an unnamed moral dilemma, a small capsule of programmed destruction, packed by fingers that trembled with exhaustion under fluorescent lights, no music, no conversation, not knowing what they were really sending. After the war, many of these workers were dismissed. They returned to anonymity. They were never decorated. Some only discovered decades later that they helped manufacture the device responsible for breaking Hitler's final offensive. And even when they did, they hesitated to be proud, because science, when armed, leaves invisible scars. And perhaps none is more painful than knowing that his contribution was crucial and silent. The proximity sensors were invisible in the field, but its construction was also invisible in the home. And this invisibility did not prevent the pain, nor did it erase the importance. The victory was technical, yes, it was strategic, logistical, ballistic, but it was also emotional. It was built under pressure, by anonymous hands which supported the weight of the war without ever entering it. If there is a force more powerful than the accuracy of a projectile, it is the persistence of those who make it possible. And that was the last link in the chain, who never pulled a trigger but made sure it worked. But there was still a final act to go, because the sound of the projectile in the sky was only half the story. It remained to be understood what was happening on the ground, seconds after the detonation, and why, among 200,000 projectiles fired, one was enough to change everything. When silence finally returned to the Ardennes, it was not the same. It was not the silence of victory. It was the final echo of an entire doctrine collapsing under the weight of industrial reality. The Third Reich was not only defeated on the field, it was defeated in the equation. Their tanks ran out of fuel, their radios without coordinates, their soldiers defenseless against an enemy coming from above and could not be seen. The collapse was not only military, it was epistemological. The Nazi belief in the superiority of man, of the soldier, of tactics, of improvisation, found in the middle of winter a weapon without a face, without vanity, without ideology. The fuse of proximity. The war changed heights, and with it, the very concept of control. Because it didn't matter how many soldiers you had anymore, nor how well trained your battalion was. What mattered was how many shells you could fire, and how many of them knew on their own when to detonate. That was the brutal lesson of the Battle of the Bulge. Logistics wins. Science, when combined with factory discipline, redefines the battlefield, and those who ignore this lose before they even shoot. Decades later, when asked why the last German offensive failed, General Hasso von Manteuffel did not speak of tanks, nor of weather, nor of bravery. He summed it all up in a single sentence. We were defeated by sensors that knew how to think. If you value research and historical truth, please like, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell. It helps us continue to reveal the facts behind the war. And comment below, what was the most shocking fact in this story? Now, don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.